a coordenação local, concluo.
Good morning, Saturday, May 2nd, 2026. And I thought I would just share something enlightening and educational and inspiring, hopefully, for my audience this morning, May 2nd, 2026, 10 a.m. And Mark Kulak, Houstonic.live. This is not a channel, this is not a mission where we're here for, complaining and fear-mongering and so on. Of course, as most of you probably know, it was the drug epidemic in the United States, perhaps above and beyond anything else. There was Lyme disease as well, but that got me into whatever it is I'm doing right now, which we can further refine and talk about later on, or other times. But we're trying to understand what are the big stories really, behind the scenes, and we don't believe it's cults and evil and so on. There's big things which have been happening for dozens of decades, maybe 100 years or more, and some of them have manifested in perhaps some bad things and bad decisions happening. But what is going on? Okay, what does drive medicines, vaccines? What does drive space exploration? What does drive energy? What does drive the 100, 200, 300 year outlook behind the scenes at the big meetings? And I believe that we do a pretty good job at conveying that, and that is a differentiator on this channel. Here is a article which I'm just going to read. I'll comment on it a little bit, and that's it for this morning. Anyways, it's on a channel called UnDark, UnDark. And the title of the article, it is a July 12th, 2020 article titled, "Despite a Skyward Mission, NASA Shaped the Study of Life on Earth." Subtitle is "Born of a Bitter Militaristic Space Race, NASA Served as an Unlikely Catalyst for a Revolution in Biology." Very important that my audience knows this. The space program is deeply connected with the study of biology on Earth. And the person that you see shown here, Lynn Margulis, last name Margulis. She passed in the year 2011. I don't know a lot about her, but from what I've read, boy, she sounded like a cool person. Lynn Margulis, who died in 2011, here she was speaking at a conference in 2005. Lynn Margulis was referenced multiple times as a friend and someone who was very much trusted by another scientist named Jan Sapp, last name Sapp. I reposted a 2013 video yesterday. You can find it on my BitChute, Rumble, Odyssey, PeerTube, and channels of Jan Sapp presenting in 2013 about evolution and biology, and about how the models of evolution have changed over time. And again, they're all models. Science is about creating models of how things work. And there's the current model, the most correct, agreed upon, accurate model. And every model is intended to be broken. The current model of what the universe, whatever you want to say, will eventually be replaced with something different, which will make the current one look ridiculous. That's the way science is. You find models that seem to work and help you understand and, operate with the world. Now, Lynn Margulis was mentioned because she played a very big role, as this article will share, in putting forth new models of evolution, which are very important. And Jan Sapp, the author of that, or I should say the person that did the presentation that mentioned Lynn Margulis yesterday, he is the person who wrote the Genes, Germs, and Genetics book, Life of Joshua Lederberg, that came out in 2021, which, as far as I know, is the only book written about Joshua Lederberg after his passing. There may be others. I know that there have been memorials to him. But he's the only one, which is absurd given the importance of Joshua Lederberg. I still like to say Lederberg. So let us read this article from July of 2020. In the year 1970, the biologist Lynn Margulis applied for a grant from the National Science Foundation. 3 years prior, a small scientific journal had published Margulis's paper, that would have been 1967, in which she outlined a provocative theory about the evolution of life. She had hoped to continue that work with funding from one of the major federal agencies to support science and engineering research. In a 1998 interview, she recalled what an NSF, National Science Foundation, grant officer had told her. A little bit of cursing, just letting you know, coming up. Quote, "There are some very important molecular biologists who think your work is shit," unquote. According to Lynn Margulis, the officer also said her work appealed to small minds in biology. His message was clear. Your application is rejected, and don't bother applying again. At first, Lynn Margulis didn't know where to turn for support, but there was a major new organization in science that offered promise. The National Aeronautical and Space Administration, or NASA for short, had been founded just 12 years earlier, in 1967, 1968, mere months after the Soviet Union had launched Sputnik, the world's first artificial satellite. Eager to do work on the origin of life, a NASA scientist approached Margulis in 1971 and agreed to provide seed funding for her research. Robert Hazen of the Carnegie Institution for Science, in an interview this year, said, quote, "This was a key moment in modern biology." Up until then, many scientists embraced neo-Darwinism, a view of evolution in which change happens slowly and is driven by small, random genetic mutations that benefit an individual or an organism, be it a finch, a giant tortoise, an orchid, or a barnacle. Over time, these changes may lead to the creation of new forms of life. It's a process that can be viewed on fossil record. For example, just 2 years after Charles Darwin published his classic text on the origin of species, a now famous fossil was discovered of a creature with teeth, long bony tail, and wings, known as Archaeopteryx. It is believed to represent a transitional form between a dinosaur and a bird. But with NASA's support, according to James Strick, that's S-T-R-I-C-K, who's the co-author of The Living Universe, and others, scientists began to study life from a completely different perspective. Rather than only using fossils hidden in rock layers to study evolution, some scientists turned to the wide variety of living bacteria. What they produced in the ensuing decades was a new microbial view of the evolution of life, one that today, according to Jan Sapp, a professor of biology and history at York University in Toronto, Canada, forms the foundation for evolutionary biology as it is routinely taught in classrooms across the world. It is a line of inquiry that has been buoyed by the emergence of advanced genetic sequencing tools that have allowed biologists to reconstruct in increasingly exquisite detail the steps taken over millennia of evolutionary change. And all that leaves NASA, an agency associated largely with feats of technology and engineering, nominally devoted to interstellar exploration and born of a bitter, militaristic geopolitical space race as the unlikely catalyst for a revolution in, of all things, biology. On a Friday afternoon on October 4th, 1957, a satellite went up, and by that evening the news had traveled around the world. The success of Sputnik seemed to herald a kind of technological Pearl Harbor, wrote Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist David Halberstam, echoing an observation from physicist Edward Teller. Halberstam wrote in 1993, quote, "Suddenly it seemed as if America were undergoing a national crisis of confidence. The 50s, it was the Cold War with Russia and the U.S. competing to lead the world to the future. Sputnik declared at a stroke that the Russians were winning the race." I got those quotes wrong, but okay. So there was a book called Why Johnny Can't Read and What You Can Do About It suddenly became a smash bestseller. Life magazine printed an article called Arguing the Case for Being Panicky. And in government, the White House and Congress shifted gears. Science was suddenly front and center. Within 11 months of Sputnik's launch, President Dwight D. Eisenhower had created the job of Presidential Science Advisor. Within 11 months of Sputnik's launch, President Dwight D. Eisenhower had created the job of Presidential Science Advisor. Congress had increased federal education funds by more than $1 billion, and NASA was founded with a $100 million annual budget. The work NASA was founded to do was to put American astronauts into space. But scientists led by Nobel Prize winner Joshua Lederberg, a name that, I must say, narrators know no other show other than Jonathan Cooey, Ph.D., will ever say, saw additional opportunities. In the weeks after Sputnik, Joshua Lederberg wrote memos to senior scientists around the world. A few months later, he formalized those memos into an article for Science magazine. Joshua Lederberg had seen Sputnik in the sky while on an academic trip to Australia. Narrator's note, I'm not sure that's totally true. Just saying. Continuing on, he was both exhilarated and frightened by what it portended for biology. Space had been breached. Much more would follow. Knowing a bit of history, he realized that humans had thoughtlessly contaminated every place they had visited on Earth. Now, humans would be traveling to moons and planets. He wrote in Science magazine, quote, "Since the sending of rockets to crash on the moon's surface is within the grasp of present technique, while the retrieval of samples is not, we are in an awkward situation of being able to spoil certain possibilities for scientific investigation for a considerable interval before we can constructively realize them." Unquote. As Joshua Lederberg and other scientists saw it, this was humanity's first chance to look for life, or even pre-life chemistry beyond Earth. That meant, first, that spacecraft had to be sterilized in order not to be sampling their own waste. And second, it meant trying to figure out what to look for. Water, carbon, other basic chemicals. What would life look like if it were just getting started? What would it look like where there were few resources? NASA had been created with distinctly political and military ambitions, but scientists like Joshua Lederberg worked hard to insert science, in particular origin of life research, into the agency's mission and to make the program civilian. Ultimately, NASA appointed a 40-year biologist named Richard S. Young to lead a program devoted to exobiology, a term coined by Joshua Lederberg to refer to scientific work on extraterrestrial life. It was clear to Young that exobiology did not fit comfortably inside the traditional biology of the great institutions of the National Science Foundation and the National Institutes of Health. So Young recruited the first generation of exobiologists from people of mixed backgrounds, including Joshua Lederberg, Lynn Margulis, and a University of Illinois professor, Carl Woese. That's Woese. When Lynn Margulis arrived in graduate school, the University of Wisconsin had just built a huge electron microscope, among the most powerful in the world. Through it, she could see things that had previously been invisible. Most notably, she observed tiny structures called mitochondria. There are hundreds on average inside each cell in a complex organism, and their function is to convert food to energy. Looking into the microscope, Margulis seized on an idea that had been floated much earlier but had never gained much currency. These mitochondria, found in cells of complex organisms from humans to horses to honeybees, are remnants of once free-living bacteria. Even more important, the origin of eukaryotic cells, all of the higher organisms, came with the merging somewhere back in evolutionary history of two simpler single-celled organisms. This symbiosis had become a new, more complex creature altogether. Lynn Margulis was soon on the path to showing how central that merger was, not just to individuals, but to evolution as a whole. After all, in this scenario, evolution occurred not gradually, but through a big, sudden change. Many biologists found the notion of symbiosis hard to accept. The writer, David Quammen, that's Quammen, asked a scientist whether Lynn Margulis was perceived back then as being radical or flaky. The scientist said. Right from the beginning, I think. But her ideas were proved right by the methods of other odd men in science, by another odd man in science who was also funded by NASA, Carl Woese, W-O-E-S-E. A biophysicist and microbiologist, Woese felt himself an outsider in biological science, unappreciated and on the sidelines. Francis Crick, James Watson, and a few others were the stars of the field. Carl wrote, I differed from the whole lot of them. While others obsessed about the grand molecule that carries life, DNA, Carl Woese instead fell in love with the skinny, single-stranded ribosomal RNA that took the rich information stored in DNA and made it into working molecules, the proteins of living cells. This molecule is the most conserved of all those in biology, meaning it can be found in every living thing and is likely to have existed for all of the 4 billion years of life on Earth. If you were going to compare creatures to determine which came before and which were the most similar, this would be the part to compare. For big animals, comparing necks and limbs and other features worked pretty well. But for the rest of living things, which are microscopic and basically round or oblong, that approach was useless. So Carl Woese, I didn't know they would say the name so much, so I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, and his team began to extract RNA from living organisms. They strung it out in bits on a sheet of wet plastic so that they could eventually compare the genetic sequences of microbes. Carl Woese thus pressed forward a new kind of fossil record, one that marked similarities and differences between certain key molecules. In diving into this record, he discovered an entirely new form of life with genetic sequences unlike bacteria and unlike the eukaryotes that made up bigger creatures in biology. He eventually called the unknown creatures archaea. Lynn Margulis had worked not with molecular fragments of creatures, as Carl Woese had, but up to her elbows in the slimy creatures themselves. Lynn Margulis and Carl Woese were something of opposite characters. She was warm and social. Woese was somewhat reclusive and shy. He studied medicine for 2 years, then quit after the first 2 days of his rotation in pediatrics. He could party with a very few close friends, but rarely. The two each had a bit of disdain for the other's specialty. Lynn Margulis thought of molecular biology as sterile and divorced from real life. Carl Woese thought of the creatures of biology as messy and confusing, not at the intellectual center of things. But when it came to proving Lynn Margulis' hypothesis that the mitochondria in humans and all other animals and plants were bacterial, it was Carl Woese's methods that gave the initial proof. Let's see here. W. Doolittle, a NASA-funded, longer article than I thought. W. Doolittle, a NASA-funded biologist at Dalhousie University in Halifax, Canada, was intrigued by Lynn Margulis' work. He said her ideas didn't seem all that flaky to me because there was some work already out there, and even though it had come along decades before we had been born. Even though it had come out decades before we had been born, unquote, he said. With advances in gene sequencing technology, he spotted an opportunity to answer the open question of whether mitochondria evolved from free-living bacteria. All a scientist needed to do was to pinpoint the genetic sequence of mitochondrial RNA and then compare it with the sequences of bacterial RNA and of nuclear RNA. Which was it more like? In the early 1970s, one of Woese's lab members arrived in Halifax and joined Doolittle's group. Linda Bonin, that's B-O-N-E-N, or Bonin, was an expert in the new sequencing techniques, and in the ensuing years, her skills, along with the help from another researcher, Michael Gray, would make such genetic comparisons possible. The work resulted in a number of papers, including one published in 1977, showing that RNA in wheat mitochondria doesn't resemble RNA inside wheat's nucleus. Instead, it resembles the RNA of bacteria. Essentially, years of doubt and debate ended at once. Lynn Margulis' hypothesis was demonstrated correct. In 1983, she won membership in the National Academy of Sciences, the single badge that in America says you are a top-ranking scientist. She later won the highest honor in American science, the National Medal of Science. It all came in a string of work by outside the mainstream scientists working with fresh NASA money made possible by Sputnik. They remade the central theme of biology. Doolittle said, quote, "This is a new biology," and he said it in a telephone interview from Nova Scotia. "It's microbially oriented rather than just animal or plant oriented." As a student, Doolittle learned about animals and plants. He said, "We thought of bacteria as an afterword." He said, "Now it's clear that the world is microbial." And this shift, says Doolittle, is due to the pioneering work of scientists like Lynn Margulis and Carl Woese. All of this has put new opportunities before students. Biology students now range all over the world, many to extreme environments, to seek out new bacteria and learn how they survive. One of the biggest projects in all of biology, the Deep Carbon Observatory, which I've never heard of until just now, has completed its first 10 years of exploring relations between bacteria and the planet with more than 1,200 scientists and 55 nations. Interesting. That has deepcarbon.net is a whole web page. The wider public has caught on too. Margaret McFall Ngai, an animal physiologist and biochemist at the University of Hawaii, illustrates it this way. "If, getting on a plane, I make the mistake of saying I work on microbiology and human health," she says, her seatmate will inevitably ask about the human microbiome. The subfield devoted to the bacteria that live on and inside of us is one of many with roots in the new biology. By the way, the term microbiome is another term thought of by Joshua Lederberg. And in fact, the term exobiology is also a term created by Joshua Lederberg. And in fact, the word plasmid is also a term thought of by Joshua Lederberg. It's amazing how so much of this world was pioneered, and the framework was sorted out or proposed by Lederberg, and it's still there and it's still growing, and no one will talk about it. Very sad. So, I mentioned this because of Lynn Margulis, and it's not clear, even though of the funding that she received from NASA, how close she was with Joshua Lederberg, but they definitely, you can find letter correspondence between the two of them. If you go to the National Library of Medicine archive of Joshua Lederberg's papers, you'll find that he had collaborated with her, sent letters to her, and I think that they had met multiple times and were friends. Lynn Margulis' Wikipedia page, she passed in 2011 at age 73. Fascinating woman. She had her first child very young, I think. She finished her PhD in her early 30s with 4 children. But not that a woman should be defined by the person that she's married to. Her first husband was Carl Sagan. Keep in mind, Carl Sagan and Joshua Lederberg were very close, working side by side on the for NASA, for how to describe or how to design equipment and experiments which would go on spacecraft to search for microbial life or to search for signs of life or the potential for life on other planets. If you go to Houstonic.live and if you go to the playlists and shared videos 2026, scroll down to the bottom. Now, I haven't shared, as a few I haven't cleaned up yet, but you'll find a video. Oh my goodness, did I not post it yet? I don't have the thumbnail on here. That's no good. I got to fix that. That stinks. Let's see. How else would I find it? In fact, you don't even, you can just go to my own archive here. And I think I posted it. Let's see here. It was within the last month or so. Yeah, here we go. The Viking mission, the search for life on Mars. You can find it right there. And you can also find this video on YouTube. The Viking mission, the search for life Mars. Someone did this as a hobby of theirs. They put this video together. It talks about the Viking missions, Viking 1, Viking 2, landing on Mars, and about how these incredibly expensive life detection units, which were designed by Joshua Lederberg, Carl Sagan. Carl Sagan, there's presentations with Carl Sagan talking about it, and others, and what the experiments found and what didn't find. And it also gets you to think about how the perspective of how we would understand life on Earth is impacted by how we have to then think and detect life off of Earth, in space, on rocks, asteroid, other planets, other moons. Looking at life on Earth from a different perspective really changed things and was a big part of encouraging this this evolution. Good to see there. Anyways, so I think that's enough. So you can watch that, enjoy that. The last little teaser I'll give you is one of the main reasons why I revisited these Viking lander missions is because I went through the newspaper articles and it was Sidney Brenner, Joshua Lederberg, and a chemist named Leslie Orgel, Orgel, who are and Carl Sagan, part of putting these things together. Leslie Orgel, by the way, was a friend of Jeffrey Epstein in the 1980s. So while everyone is running around talking about Epstein and his crimes, Epstein is somehow friendly with some of these Salk Institute scientists, and a doctor in Memorial Sloan Kettering made Jeffrey Epstein the godfather of her 3 kids. Doesn't quite add up with the mythology that's being pushed upon people, but whatever. if you go to YouTube and just search for, if we just search for Carl Sagan Viking, you can find 59-minute presentations that Carl Sagan did back in the late 1970s talking about the Viking mission. Carl Sagan in his prime. Such a pleasant person to listen to present. So this is where we're at, folks. This is not a fear-mongering channel. We're trying to figure it all out together. We're trying to analyze it and collect it and preserve it and see that we have a whole lot more in common than we have to differentiate us. That's it. Thank you. Take care. Have a great morning. God bless. Thanks for listening. And maybe we'll do another show later. But have a good one. Peace. Love you.